You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
You're listening to the Rock Art Podcast. Join us every week for fascinating tales of rock art, adventure, and archaeology. Find our contact info in the show notes and send us your suggestions.
Well, hello out there in Archaeology Podcast land. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, and it's episode 160 with one of our recent guest scholars, George Nash, who hails from the UK and is affiliated with quite a bevy of different entities, both working as an archaeologist, anthropologist, and someone who has a great depth and breadth of experience working both in new discoveries and also information about the line of hominids, but also about some of the purportedly oldest rock art on Earth. So, George, how's that for an introduction?
I'm flattered, Alan. I really in fact, I might sort of take a transcript of what you just said.
Oh, there you go. Use it again, right?
Yeah.
So tell us about your passion, your most recent passion, and what you've been up to since our last discussion.
Yeah, there's so much going on at the moment. I mean, given my age, I thought I was going to sort of take up gardening, but that hasn't been the case. It's just been an absolutely wonderful ride, really. And I suppose the two things which have been really exciting for me have been obviously working. I've been working in a site called Rising Star in South Africa, which is in the cradle of humankind, just west of Johannesburg. Mm-hmm. And the Rising Star cave is both fantastic. It's also very difficult to maneuver through, and it has some of the most remarkable potential archaeology in Africa, if not the world, at the moment.
How old are the materials in Rising Star?
Between 225 and 350,000 years ago.
And are we talking about humankind or proto-hominids or?
This is the controversy.
The $1 million question.
It is, yeah. Well, the researcher who's been working there was two researchers of note, a guy called Lee Berger and another guy called John Hawkes. And they've been running a project for quite a few years now. And it starts off in 2014 when sports cavers were doing what the sports cavers do, going down very tiny holes in the most dangerous conditions. Mm-hmm. And the two sports cavers came across a chamber now called a Naledi chamber in the heart of a 15-kilometre cave system called Rising Star. And they came across what they believed to be human remains. And anyway, so they did the right thing. I think they got in contact with the police, and then obviously the police weren't going to go down there. But Lee Berger was actually around at the time, and he had a look at some of the photographs and then got very excited. And then the next thing you find out, there's an excavation going on after 2014. They discovered a new hominin called Homo naledi, and just a remarkable discovery. And what was remarkable is that in this one chamber, they found, I think, around about 15 burials.
Burials?
Yeah, burials. There are either burials or what I would call interments, where the body is just placed in a particular area of the chamber. Okay. And what happens over 300,000 years, it gets covered in soil. But it was a controversial bit of work anyway, considering the deposition and the difficulty of getting down there as well. Mm-hmm. And then a few years later, he discovered what he thought was rock art. And this is where we get called in to first of all verify it. And again, there were one or two interesting things down there in Dragon's Back chamber, and some of it was and some of it wasn't. I think it's very easy if you're not a rock art specialist to sort of look at these things and keep on looking, and eventually you'll find something, but usually it's something like a natural sort of striation or whatever. Mm-hmm. And I think you must be, I suppose you're probably aware that the geology down there is what they call elephant skin dolerite. Okay. And there's a clue in the name, elephant skin, which is very linear, and also has vertical lines, diagonal lines, circular lines. And again, you start putting those things together, you start quite rightly to think, well, there could be something interesting down here. Anyway, we got called in. This is the first art team which I'm a part of.
So tell me a bit about the rock art itself. Is it simply incised lines, or is it color?
It was incised lines, but when we were, a lot of it we dismissed. I wasn't that convinced that what we had down there was rock art. But that's a matter of discussion and argument. But what we did find other stuff down there, which was really very interesting indeed, including pigments. And but the big problem is with all these cave sites is that you've got to have just an element of good luck on your side, where you want some calcite flow flowing over it, so you can do uranium thorium dating, for example, and get some idea about how old the pigments are, and also to prove that they are pigments made by hominin agency. And so we didn't have that luck, but we've got that down there, and there's other things down there as well, which is going to be recorded in an academic paper relatively soon, I think this year.
Are there any artifacts or chipstone, flakestone, anything like that?
Yes, but the access to some of the other chambers was very difficult indeed.
Okay.
And in fact, I took the decision very early on that I was not going to go in some of them, and I didn't. I just think you've got to be very agile, very young, which I'm not, and you like very tight, squeezy spaces.
But they have discovered those kinds of artifacts?
Well, yes, but again, I think there's a little bit of controversy about whether they are made by hominin agency or not. So again, as a problem, it's all very much in the air at the moment. But I think Lee's going in the right direction in terms of getting a good scientific narrative from the work he and his colleagues have been doing down there for the last 10 years or so.
Would those be some of the earliest formalized interments in the world, if they were burials per se?
I would say so, yeah. Well, at the moment they are, most certainly they are, yeah. And the good thing about it was, which he quickly recognised, that there was no apex predators going down there and chomping on the...
So that's wonderful. That's so you have almost a discrete expression of whatever sorts of activities were being done there. That's great.
And also the interesting thing as well, that down that one chamber I mentioned, is that nearly all of them, well, as far as I'm aware, nearly all of them were female burials as well. So
they're all females?
Yeah. Yeah. So the interesting point.
Oh my word!
Yeah. Well, the most interesting point is that they're somewhere probably in that cave system where you've got a chamber devoted to male burial as well. Yeah. So, or interment. So I think it's where Lee and John are going, and his team and their team are going forward with to say some very interesting things, and I dare say it'll culminate hopefully one day in a large glossy monograph which we can all have a good look at.
Yeah. Now, of course, with some of the discoveries of the cave art in South America, and the antiquity of some of the sites in South America, they're sort of in lockstep with our new understanding of the peopling of the Americas and the antiquity involved. So I would imagine you may have some reflections or data or evidence regarding that topic as well.
Yeah, one of my passions sort of from about 2009 up until quite recently was South America and this big question about peopling of the Americas. Sure. And I mean, I should really talk about the context first before I go on into detail. But as you're probably aware, there was a very much an American approach to suggest that really nothing had hit America or South America, most certainly.
It was 13.5.
Yeah, I was trying to get the words out. 13 BP.
Yeah.
Or 13.5 BP before present.
Exactly.
And of course, that we went along with that story for quite some time. And in fact, there was a lot of the American universities were actually promoting that idea from the 1930s. Right through to quite recently in many respects. But secretly going on in South America, there were sort of various sort of ideas of potential rock art and archaeological sites, which the Clovis tradition. And the Clovis tradition, as again many of your listeners will know, is that kicks off in New Mexico from a site called Clovis. But I think at the time, sort of I was down in South America, there have been sort of discoveries at Monteverde in Chile of 14.3 BP, Buttermilk Creek in Texas, 15.5, White Sands in New Mexico, 21 to 25. These are footprints recently been found.
Yes, exactly.
And the place I really liked, because I was actually working not too far from there, was Paisley Caves in Oregon, where which was quite interesting. Back when I was there, back in the late 1990s, they were starting to make inroads into sort of pre-Clovis stuff, and they've now got dates of around about sort of 16,000 BP. And I guess they keep on digging and they keep on researching and dating, they'll get earlier dates. And again, it gives me the theory that, or not so much the theory, but more likely the probability that early modern humans are coming across the Bering Straits maybe in three ways or three routes. One, which is the one which has been really debunked in many respects, but with sort of very low sort of sea level rise at the time of the 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 years ago, when a lot of the ice was locked up in the Laurentide ice sheets and in Europe, the Fennoscandian ice sheets, sea level were around about 70 meters to 100 meters lower than they are today. So that would have exposed a lot of land to the west of Alaska, of course, with the Bering Straits, south of Alaska, and also west of the Canadian provinces, right down to California. So, we're talking about a really, potential sort of route through the Americas, North America, exploding into the Americas as we know it, or the United States as we know it, through to Central America, and then exploding into South America. And so when I was down in Capivara, first of all, in 2009, I did meet one of the most important people down there, a woman called, or an anthropologist called Niedekide Guidon, and her colleague Anne-Marie Pressé. Mm-hmm. And they've been working on some really interesting sites in the state of Pui, and it was within what we call the Capivara National Park. And it's from there I got my sort of first hints that there was something quite strange going on, because some of the dates, which I think are quite reliable on the rock art, and I'll talk to you about those in a minute, were quite interesting in that they predated the Clovis tradition by about 15, 20,000 years.
And that's crazy.
So you have to ask yourself, what the heck is going on? Are there sort of corrupt dates, or are the dates genuine? And if so, how did they get there? And I can remember talking to some eminent Brazilian archaeologists and one Portuguese archaeologist, Professor Luís Usterbeck from the University of Coimbra. And he said to me, George, there are 4 potential routes into the Capivara and South America: north, south, east, and west. And you could dismiss 3 of those. I said, well, what do you mean by that? And he said, well, obviously, they're coming from the north. So I think, and I'm going to stick my neck out here, although we've got dates of human or community movements coming from across the Bering Straits, clearly at around about 13, 14, 15,000 BP before present. Mm-hmm. It's more than likely we have what I would call waves of community coming through that passage, which is now the Pacific Ocean, but would have been a part of the continental shelf belonging to Alaska and Western Canada.
I guess I have an interesting sort of situation. I consider myself a Californianist for the most part, but also the Great Basin, touching upon the American Southwest and Mexico. But they threw me into the largest project I've ever been involved with, and it was $9-10 million in Oregon. And of course, so I've been working there for the last 4 years, and I've been immersing myself in all this amazing new knowledge. Yeah. And so it is interesting to hypothesize or begin to understand when and if that particular peopling of the Americas took place and what mode it took place, vis-a-vis terrestrial or maritime. And there's a lot of discussion about the possibility of maritime, adventures. And I don't know if that is something that has crossed your mind, or if that's something that people have talked about vis-a-vis South America.
Well, it's funny you should say that, because in the last couple of years, I've been thinking about the idea about, what if there was island hopping across the Pacific, for example, because we have some of the oldest traditions now. When you think about the rock art that's been found in Sulawesi in Indonesia with dates of 52,000, why not? I mean, it's a very treacherous route, I dare say.
Let's hold that for a moment.
Yeah, sure, yeah.
And we'll call this our first segment, and then we'll begin to sort of entertain the notion of dealing with some of this rather radical and controversial information that is most engaging. See you on the flip-flop, gang. Welcome back, gang. This is your host, Dr. Alan Garfinkel, We're blessed and honored to have Professor George Nash, who's talking about a lot of things all over the globe, from South America to Africa to all over the continents and the globe, talking about how we do rock art and some of the amazing and controversial discoveries that are going on throughout our specialty areas. And one of those relates to the South American rock art and its age. Am I correct?
That's correct. Yeah. I say we've just been talking earlier about the Clovis tradition and the potential of a pre-Clovis tradition. That's rock art and archaeology before 13,000 before present. And I suppose why I'm here is to talk about the idea of rock art in South America, in particularly in Brazil. That goes back much, much, much further.
How did they date it? How controversial are those dates? And what would we need to refine these dates and provide, the more compelling and, more compelling information that we think would be firmer and of greater control, please?
Yeah, I think the big problem, Alan, is that the area which I focused on was the Serra de Capivara, which is in northeastern Brazil.
Sure.
And it is to give your listeners an idea of what it's like. It's a massive, big sandstone massif, a big chunk of rock in the middle of nowhere. And it's surrounded by Katanga Desert, which is like a scrubland desert. Mm-hmm. And the big problem with that is, well, first of all, it's ideal for producing rock art because it's a porous rock and you can add pigments to it, no problem at all. It's sandstone as well. If it's sandstone, there's probably pigments within certain sandstones, such as hematite, for example, which you can either extract from the rock itself or you may find it on the floor and apply it easily. But in terms of dating, it's very difficult to date. And there's just one thing one site that really sort of excited me, which is a site called Pedra Ferrada, and the overhangs and rock shelters within that area of the Capivara. And just to put you in the picture, we have around about 800 sites around the Capivara. And my history with it was actually quite interesting because I went there, first of all, as a delegate to a conference, and I got looking around, and that was exciting in itself. But when I came back to the UK, I was very fortunate to examine a PhD by a Brazilian lady called Ana Nescaranto. And she had taken the archaeology a step further and first of all started to document. So we started to look at a landscape study, which was again interesting. And what was really telling to me was that nearly all the rock art sites were on the peripheral edges of the Serra de Capivara, this large sandstone massif, and there were little inlets, little valleys going into the sandstone massif, and they were obviously created geologically through water, mainly water and weathering, which had created these quite deep valleys, but with rock shelters either side. And it's within those rock shelters where you got some really interesting stuff. And one particular rock shelter, which was really interesting in terms of dating, was Toca de Estrada, and this particular cave or rock shelter had the most exquisite paintings on it I've ever seen in South America.
Really?
No carvings, just paintings. So you had a lot of very beautiful figurative animals on this particular cave. You had also human figures, and the animals were of the animals that you would see around your landscape, however long that may have been, which was things like capivara, fox, deer, and they're all in a sort of very action sort of stance where they were either running or whatever. And then in other rock shelters, you had human figures dancing around trees. You had them kissing, which I thought was lovely. You also had some very nice sex scenes that go to those today. But what was interesting about this particular cave, this Toca de Estrada, was that they dated the rock out there to between 26 and 29,000 BP before present, which you look at the sort of the narrative of what was going on in South America, which was an unbelievable date. But obviously now, because of new dating techniques,
how did they date it?
Right. Well, this is interesting because the cave is a large overhang, and the artists at this time, this is between 26 and 29,000 before present, were painting on the ceiling rather than on the side walls.
Okay.
And it's on what we would call laminated stone. So the geology was a series of laminations, sandstone laminations. Mm-hmm. And what would happen is that during the weathering processes over geological time, these laminations would fall away because of freeze-thaw processing, because of moisture getting into the cracks, and then them freezing up, expanding the gap, and then they would fall down onto the ground. And there we have, over time, the pieces that have fallen down would be then buried. And so archaeologists started to dig in the area underneath this ceiling, and they found a series of layers. And in one of those layers was a painted section, too big for bioturbulation or worm turbulation. So it had actually fallen off at the time of that particular stratigraphic layer. And what they found in that stratigraphic layer was organic material, which they could date, obviously using radiocarbon dating. Mm-hmm. They did, and they got those dates of 26 to 29,000. Now, that's what we would call an indirect dating, not a direct dating, because we don't have that fortunate position. We're not in that fortunate position to do that. But from that particular dating sequence, and it wasn't just one or two pieces, there were a lot of other pieces as well, which came slightly before and obviously after, as the stratigraphy of that rock shelter built up. And this was part of a large project which was going on between the late 1970s and the 1980s by Nia de Guidon and Anne-Marie Pressé. And they also dug Pedra Ferrada, which is a massive big rock shelter. And again, they were getting very interesting dates, very controversial dates from there. So they got dates to 60,000. And this is where you have to sort of be very careful, because the dates were they were radiocarbon dated. They're going right to the very, very limit of radiocarbon dating. In fact,
they are.
They actually used pollutants for some of the dating. And obviously we would use today new techniques to get better dates. But the 60,000 date is right at the bottom of the stratigraphy of the Pedra Ferrada rock shelter. And what they got there was a series of burnt areas, or what they thought were hearths. But controversially, you could actually say, well, actually, it could be just forest fires. It could be a strike of lightning coming down, setting fire to the Katanga forest, and that fire moved into the rock shelter by natural causes, by the wind blowing the fire in, and there, lo and behold, you've got your dated material. And I also, again, controversially, it's quite some, the stratigraphy for 60,000 was quite some way down in the sequence. So we're talking about 15 meters of archaeology.
15 meters. And 15 meters?
15 meters. Yeah. So it's a biggie. It's a big one. Yeah.
It's a big one, yes.
Yeah. But what I'll give both archaeologists anthropologists their due. They have left about 20% of the stratigraphy left.
Sure.
Knowing full well that since the 1980s, archaeological techniques have moved on quite significantly. And as a result of that sort of technology, there is a potential for people like you, Alan, to go there and excavate the site. But what was interesting is, again, it's just a thing you have to conjure in your mind, that the rock art itself was a long, narrow strip of a painted fresco panel. There's a series of panels with, as I say, animals, human figures, geometric forms over I think about a 60-meter spread. So it was quite a large rock shelter with a lot of rock art in it, and that was quite significantly higher than the 60,000 date.
You know what surprises me about this, because we have a fair understanding of North American rock art in terms of its age and its style, right?
Yeah.
And this basal style, the earliest rock art, let's say from the Paleo-Indian period, whatever you want to call it, let's say late Pleistocene to early Holocene, is exclusively abstract. Yes. There's no representational, no naturalistic elements in it at all.
No.
So then we go to South America, and we see it's loaded with these naturalistic, representational animals, people, what have you. And we see the ages that are inferred in association with them. And it begs the question. You go, Well, what happened?
Well, yes, exactly. Well, this is the point where I'm starting. You start to rethink some of your ideas.
Absolutely.
About the idea about it's coming from somewhere else. That the influences are not coming from North America. Maybe there is. Yeah, it begs the idea that maybe we're looking elsewhere for in terms of colonization. However,
and it must be a whole different set of circumstances, channels, cosmology, theology, something very different going on in South America versus North America. I guess, right?
I would say so, yes, but also you have to take into consideration the environments, probably the environments of North America. So we're looking at
very different.
From New Mexico, California to the Canadian border, where the Fennoscandian ice sheets were starting to. Maybe the environmental influences and that would have affected the social influences, which would have made people consider doing abstract art. Although there is some, if I remember rightly, there are some there are some engravings in the Midwest, and I forget the guy who's done it, but he found two potential mammoths, which I know are again controversial. Although one of the mammoths, I was quite convinced that it was a mammoth, rather than a flea, which was postulated by a colleague of mine.
And they think they have found a plaque. I think it's in Florida,
a plaquette,
in the ocean of a mammoth as well. So there is exceptions to the rule, but damn rare.
Oh God, yeah. Well, either damn rare, Alan, or we're not looking hard enough.
Yes, it really is striking, unusual, controversial, and certainly endlessly engaging about the kinds of issues and subject matter and sort of rewriting of the past that we're going through right here. We thought we'd figured out a few things. We're answering or asking the right questions, and now everything is upside down. The thing that chilled me, sort of, made me laugh, is when you told me those burials were all women. Were all women, and I've had interviews recently with a number of the scholars that have found that the cave of the hands and the finger flutings are all made by women, and young women at that, and that they were involved in the caves, which again rewrites everything we thought we knew about the nature of the social structure or the ability of people, what was going on during that time. Am I right?
I would agree with you, because if you look at the ethnographic and the anthropological evidence, it's going on. Initiation is a classic example where you go from boy to man and girl to woman. You have to do something, and I think that the idea of the quest, where you have to do something quite stupidly dangerous, is something which we're seeing in a lot of European caves, for example. You've got rock art right at the back of places like Rouffignac, for example, which go back 2 or 3 kilometers from the cave entrance. Right. You either have to be stupid, drunk, or going through initiation to go and do it. All three.
Or all three. Well, let's stop there for a moment. This is segment 2 on our amazing worldwide rock art and prehistory adventure. See you in the flip-flop, gang. Welcome back, gang. You're in the third and final segment of our 160th episode. We have our colleague, Professor George Nash. And we're talking about sort of the nature of scientific exposition, let's call it, and where we are in the cycles. We're starting to rewrite or rethink some of the basic building blocks of understanding the nature of human existence, certainly in the Americas, but I guess even around the world. Am I correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you've only got to look. If you're watching also reading the archaeological news every week, there's a new discovery, and there's a new dating sequence coming in, and we're pushing back certainly the movements of early modern humans way back. I mean,
and the character of those movements, or the demographics, the social structure, the way we think about a lot of this is open for discussion.
Well, what makes me laugh, Alan, is when you have someone making a discovery, say we've got the oldest rock art here in Wales, Wales, for example, it'll be superseded within maybe a year.
Yeah,
and someone will find something earlier, and that rewrites the history. I mean, there's a classic story which I'll talk to you about maybe in another episode, but we have a very famous site here in Wales called the Red Lady of Paverland, which was radiocarbon dated 3 times from 1964 right through to quite recently, and every new date completely turns around the environment that this burial was placed in. And so again, it's not controversial because the dating is pretty damn accurate. But what is really interesting is that, what you thought was a straightforward transition between cold environment to warm environment, which you give a big green tick to. We're now talking about a time when this burial was taking place in the most extreme cold weathers of minus 10 summer temperatures,
wow.
minus 10 centigrade. So it just gives you an idea about how we have to keep on thinking and rethinking about certain sites, certain key sites around the world, including South America. I mean, although I personally believe that the indirect dating for the painted panels that flaked off and fell into that little rock shelter near Pedra Ferrada in Serra Capivara is an acceptable thing, it's an indirect dating. There's a lot of archaeologists would say, well, you can't say that, can you? I mean, there's been cave sites in Europe where we've had indirect dating, but it's never been accepted, or it's become very controversial and also very argumentative, because as you well know, Alan, academics tend to want to stand their ground and they won't budge either way. And so that's
But again, I guess you've heard this, it's such a hackneyed saying, but extraordinary results demand extraordinary evidence. So,
yes,
and so we need to have compelling and independently verified information that will allow us to confidently assess the character as to age, and also in terms of this thing about sex and age. It's almost mind-boggling when you think about it in terms of turning this thing over completely, when you find out that young women are doing cave paintings at the dawn of humanity.
And you have to ask why not?
Why not? Yeah,
because in the anthropological record there are many matriarchal societies within that record. So if you've got it going on now and you've got it going on in the ethnographic record, why not the archaeological record? And I'm very careful when I'm talking to students, when I say, he and she, or she and he. And some of my male students don't like that because they still consider that silly idea about man the hunter.
Of course. Yeah.
And that's not the case these days.
Not anymore.
No,
that's gone by the by. And you asked me what my research, in terms of my own archaeological research and rock art studies has done. And I'm working on a book. It's taken a lot longer than I had expected. But you talk about turning the tables in the philosophy completely around. In the Kosos, what our general understanding was that there was a lot of decorated animal-human figures there. That was the second most popular element within the canon of the archaeology, which of course is one of the greatest densities of rock art in the Western Hemisphere. We've got a couple 100,000 of individual instances of rock art in about a 10-mile by 10-mile area. Well, lo and behold, I had a PhD student and another woman who published a book about this. When we began to look at those individual figures that are animal-human, they're mainly hybrids between birds and humans, but they're also entwined with snakes. But the most important element of them is, I would say maybe a third of them can be classified as to sex. And guess what? They're women. They're not men, they're women. And that throws a monkey wrench in much of what people have said or thought they said, or characterized in terms of sometimes this androcentric shamanistic element for one, and for our understanding of the nature of the theology of foragers at that early date. Go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I mean, again, there's a couple of interesting stories to discuss on that one. I mean, one of my heroes is Claude Lévi-Strauss, and he did the famous book Honey and Ashes, amongst other things as well. But he looked on this idea of formulaics. And when you look at a story, so for example, in the West, we'd have Little Red Riding Hood, for example, or Goldilocks and the Three Bears. And they all have, if you break that story down to its basic level, you have a formulaic, and the formulaics are good against evil, male, female, dark, light, all those structural oppositions and...
binary.
Binary systems, yeah. And I think what's really quite important about that is that it applies to nearly every story. And I mean, one of my most wonderful experiences in the Capivara was, again, around Pedraforada, looking at this beautifully long 60-metre plus fresco of different types of art, which incidentally, I forgot to mention really, which is important, is that there's a lot of superimposition going on there on various panels, which tells you that there's a lot of earlier stuff going on there as well. But
sure.
One of the most remarkable things I ever saw there was two very simple figures in a gentle kiss. It's actually called The Kiss, and it's a male and female. I think it's a male and female, and they're embraced in a kiss. And it's just, the art is so simple, but so powerful as well, about the idea about human love and about human relationships and about that connection between two human beings. Now, again, I'm not quite sure which was the female and which was the male, or if they were both male or both female. I'm not quite sure. But what it does tell you about the tenderness that the artist is bringing out on that particular fresco.
The emotion. Exactly.
Yeah. And it just tells you that what we're dealing with people like you and I, and Chris. We're dealing with people. We could be talking about somebody in 2026 rather than 26,000 years ago, for example. And that's really quite an important thing to say, really. And it's
I think it is too. And I've always brought that to the fore, that what you see emblazoned on the walls of these rocks, on the canvases of the rocks, is certainly a bit of a time machine, but these are people. And these are people that have wants and needs and passions and have the same frustration and angst and emotions that we have in living our lives.
Exactly. Yeah. I suppose the frustrating thing, if you're coming from a scientific point of view, is, as you already correctly mentioned, is the idea of, a secure date, for example. The one thing we can do now as well, as you may have gathered, we can do Raman spectroscopy and look at the organic binders in the images to see if there's anything to do with, if there's a pattern emerging about whether using a particular organic material to bind the hematite together before they apply it on the walls. And again, archaeologists, I won't call myself an archaeologist, but archaeologists tend to think, oh, it's hematite, that's it, full stop. But quite clearly now we're starting to look at the chemical compounds and the chemical particulates used to create a paste which you can apply to the wall. And that applies to every bit of painted rock art across the world, be it hematite, gorthite, or any other pigment that you're using. So there's a lot of things we can start to say about these things. And I think I'll give Nia de Guidon and Anne-Marie Pressy their due. They've created a really good foundation for understanding the archaeology of the Capivara, but it was done in the 1970s, 1980s. And I published something with her about 5 or 6 years ago.
Now, you were saying, I think, to move to a close, that you have a book that's coming out, correct?
Well, there's a book. No, it's a book that's been published. In fact, it's published way back in those years of 2000.
But the South America.
Yeah, 2017 it was published.
Oh, wow, okay.
It's published by Routledge, and it's a book called Archaeologies of Rock Art, South American Perspectives, and it was edited by myself, Andrew Troncoso, and Philippe Armstrong. And basically we look at, I think it's about 15 chapters, which looks at various rock art assemblages around South America.
Yeah.
And I had the blessing of going to Chile at that time, and that's what inspired me to put the book together with my two colleagues. So we've got a really good spread of work. The one place we haven't got yet is the work that's going on in Colombia at the moment, and the wonderful rock art that's recently been discovered in Venezuela. And that's very exciting. There's a colleague of mine who's a Venezuelan, who's working on some work on some rock art panels to the south of Venezuela. And I'm going to be going there in 2027.
Well, Professor Nash, I think with all your adventure and everything you're involved in, we're going to have you back again for a third look-see in the near future to see what other discoveries and lacunae, little holes you've gone down in terms of some of the discoveries. And you seem like you're enraptured with some of the more controversial and exciting new discoveries. And it's a blessing to have you on our show. It really is.
Thank you very much, Alan.
See you in the flip-flop, gang.
Thanks for listening to the Rock Art Podcast with Dr. Alan Garfinkel and Chris Webster. Find show notes and contact information at www.archpodnet.com/rockart. Thanks for listening, and thanks for sharing this podcast with your family and friends.
Thanks for listening to this podcast. The Archaeology Podcast Network's chief editor is Rachel Roden. Our executive producer is Ashley Airy. Our social media and newsletter coordinator is Matilda Siebrecht. The APN was founded by Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle on December 1st, 2014. We're supported by our amazing podcast hosts, many volunteers, and listeners like you. Check out membership at www.archpodnet.com/members.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com.